Hello and welcome. We're here with Alex Clackson, who is an advisor to governments in the former Soviet Union and expert on the post-Soviet space. Today we're going to talk about the announcement of a UK government minister that Russian players could be barred from Wimbledon if they don't denounce Vladimir Putin. But first, I thought I'd get your opinion, Alex. You're obviously Russian. How have things felt in the UK in the past few weeks since the invasion? Have you noticed a big change in your life or your family's life?
Well, we haven't seen a kind of a direct impact on us. Obviously, we've been in the UK for over 20 years now, so we're very much assimilated into the kind of UK society. But it's been strange to notice that kind of the world and especially the UK seem to suggest that almost every Russian is responsible for the conflict, which does almost create some kind of a feeling that a Russian person ought to be ashamed of being a Russian person. I think that's quite unprecedented, really. From in previous conflicts, we've never seen a situation where a particular government suggests that all nation and all citizens of a particular nation should carry the burden of a decision made by the government. And so that's been quite difficult to process, really, because you do start to wonder whether indeed you do carry any responsibility for the decision, even though we are as a family based in the UK, but nevertheless you do still to think, well, have I played any role in this? So from that point of view, yeah, it's been rather difficult, but obviously, fortunately, we've had no kind of direct impact from this.
That's good to hear. I sort of think back to the World Cup, and I think things were starting to actually change. I think Russia's soft power was increasing. There was a bit of mistrust, I'd say, more from establishment than the public in general towards Russia, which was responsible for quite a low turnout among England fans. But everybody saw that tournament was fantastic, and we sort of likened Russians more to ourselves until this happened. And I think it's interesting, this approach of making sort of individual Russians feel bad, whether it's Russians in other countries, whether it's athletes. And I think there's an irony to that it almost shows a degree of faith in the Russian people that we wouldn't have somewhere else, likening them sort of to us, in that we think Russians might be able to change Putin's approach, athletes might be able to speak out and potentially stop this war. And I think if it was, say, China in the same situation, we might just say, well, it's a dictatorship. What's the point in stopping athletes playing? They can't do a thing. I mean, what do you think of that?
Well, yeah, I do think there is perhaps hope from countries that are obviously opposed to Russia that Russian people will position themselves as those that are opposed to the conflict. Of course, there are a significant number of people in Russia that do not support the war, obviously including myself and my family. At the same time, I think it has to be acknowledged that also perhaps even a majority. It's always hard to tell in Russia because obviously a lot of the polling organizations are kind of state-run, so it's difficult to know the kind of the exact numbers of people who actually support the war, who oppose the war. But from what I can tell, it looks like the majority are kind of take Vladimir Putin's position on the war. Obviously, the kind of the state propaganda does play a role in that as well. The Russian state propaganda, and especially now in the kind of in the regions of Russia, outside of Moscow, St. Petersburg, perhaps not many people use kind of internet resources and social media to get information. So it might be quite difficult for them to actually get a different opinion on it. But I think the idea that the Russian people can influence Vladimir Putin is it shows kind of a misunderstanding of what Russia is like, because Vladimir Putin essentially just makes all the decisions himself. Not even his closest advisors and allies in the Kremlin can influence him. And I think we saw that with this conflict where, all of them kind of stood in line and just basically told Putin what he wanted to hear. So the idea that just the ordinary people can have any influence, or even the oligarchs as well, I think that's why obviously a lot of the sanctions are being placed on oligarchs with the hope that they will also rise up and tell Putin, look, you have to change course. But I think it was I think it was Friedman, one of the Russian oligarchs, that mentioned just, I think just yesterday or this week, that it just shows complete misunderstanding of Russia. You know, oligarchs have no influence on Putin whatsoever, never mind ordinary people.
Yeah, yeah. So obviously, come on now to the statement this UK sports minister made. Not the culture secretary who's in charge of sport, but a minister. So it certainly looks the way the government's leaning. It says it needs to go beyond that, referring to Russians competing as neutral athletes. We need some potential assurance that they are not supporters of Vladimir Putin, and we are considering what requirements we may need to get assurances along those lines. Now, that's quite a strong statement and quite a significant escalation, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a strange one. It kind of opens a can of worms, really, and it's a bit of a slippery slope, really, and quite unprecedented in many ways. Obviously, first of all, I don't think there are any precedent, again, in the past for when a particular athlete had to speak out against his government, his or her government, in order to participate in a sporting competition. Um, and I don't understand how this would work on a practical level, especially with Russia, because as you may know, Russia has just kind of announced quite stringent and strict rules regarding actually criticizing the war. Well, just to be frank, you're essentially not really allowed to criticize the government's decision regarding the conflict. And in fact, you can't even use the word war in Russia, or you might face not just a fine, but actually time in prison. So if indeed this ruling by the UK minister were to go forward, it would kind of place the Russian athletes in an impossible situation between kind of a rock and a hard place, really. But where on the one side, if they don't denounce Putin, they might not be able to partake in a particular sporting competition. But at the same time, if they do, they may get arrested in Russia for that. So it doesn't seem to me like a feasible way forward. And on a kind of a more holistic basis, uh, I do feel it is a bit of a slippery slope. I mean, going forward, you know, how would this work with other countries? Would, you know, Chinese athletes, would they need to also denounce what's happening in Xinjiang, for example, or Tibet? You know, would British athletes need to come out and speak out against, you know, Britain selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, for example? I mean, where does it stop? You know, I think whilst denouncing the war is probably a right thing, going as far as actually you know, criticizing or having to criticize your own government in order to participate in a sporting competition does seem a bit you know, going over the line for me. And you know, there is also an issue perhaps of just general kind of free speech and just being able to actually have a certain opinion, because whilst you might be against the war, and as I said, most people are, including myself, there are many people in Russia who still believe, for better or worse, that Putin is a good leader. Now, obviously, it might be quite difficult for Western people to understand that. You know, how could any Russian consider Putin to be a good leader? But that's the situation. So a lot of Russians might actually be against the war, but still feel that Putin is a good leader. So for these athletes as well, they might denounce the war, but they might actually still feel that Putin is fine as a president of Russia. So it puts them in such a difficult position. I'm just not sure that it's feasible.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I think obviously we saw in the first week Andrei Rublev wrote "No War on a Camera," which was with no prompting, which was a very brave thing to do. And I sort of feel like, does this, maybe if Britain were to follow this approach, would it sort of undermine athletes speaking out in Russia, because they were previously able to say what they thought off their own back? Now the government would have a line which would be sort of half true, which is, you're only saying this because you want to keep your sporting tournaments. I think Putin, in a speech this week, already went down that line, sort of referring more to oligarchs than athletes, but saying there are some people in Russia whose minds are abroad.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. And I mean, you do also wonder that whether there will be pressure from Russians on these athletes not to participate in competitions where the athlete is required to speak out against the government in Russia. And it does go back to this point of actually suggesting that all Russians are in some way responsible for this conflict, and all of them need to carry some kind of a burden, going forward. And I think it's a situation that it's a bit of a Pandora's box, really, where you could see other countries starting to, if the UK government goes forward with this, you can see, other Russia making the same, obviously, rules as well. So if they were to ever host another competition, which obviously doesn't seem likely for now, but they may well do at some point, they might also do something similar where, they will make American athletes, condemn whatever, drone attacks in the Middle East, or previous wars that America has taken part in. So it just creates such a strange scenario where just countries require athletes to speak out against their own government in order to participate. I just don't think it's a good idea.
Yeah, I think we already had in different situation, but the Soviet war in Afghanistan, we had tit for tat Olympic boycotts between United States in 1980 and Soviet Union in 1984, and it sort of acknowledged that they weren't really successful and they didn't really make that much of a difference. Just moving on, this refers obviously to Wimbledon and tennis. Can you tell us a bit about what the profile is of tennis in Russia and how famous these players, obviously Medvedev, US Open champion, and Rublev, Kachanov, are in Russia?
Yeah, I think tennis broadly is starting to become more popular in Russia. Historically, it hasn't been one of the top sports that is followed by Russians, obviously. According to kind of the latest statistics that I looked into recently, I think football is the number one sports in Russia, which is actually surprising to me. I was thought it's going to be ice hockey, but that actually comes second. So I guess maybe the 2018 World Cup also played a part in it and actually spreading the popularity of football. Now tennis actually comes sort of around fifth or sixth in terms of popularity in Russia. Behind, as I said, football, ice hockey, basketball, volleyball, and martial arts like like boxing, etc. So whilst it's not kind of one of the top 3 or 4 sports in the country, its popularity is growing. Obviously, in the past, Russians had very famous and quite skillful Russian female tennis players, but now obviously we're seeing more and more kind of male tennis players also becoming quite good in the sport. So the popularity is growing, but it's also important to know that that Medvedev has actually, because of his actions and because of all this controversy, his profile is also rising in Russia. But you could say for all the wrong reasons, right? His outbursts recently on the tennis field, and then now because of this situation with Wimbledon, he's becoming more of a kind of a media figure in Russia, but not for his kind of tennis skills, but more kind of political controversies surrounding him.
So are you saying basically that you think Daniil Medvedev, for example, is not somebody that, if he did speak out, would be top of the list of athletes that could influence the Russian people in how they think? He'd be quite a sort of parochial figure.
Yeah, I mean, he, as I said, because tennis is not as popular as some other sports, he doesn't carry that sort of weight as perhaps some athletes do. For example, the Russian national football team, there are a few individuals who do actually carry quite a lot of influence, including Artem Zuba, who used to captain Russia, for example. He has a very strong following amongst many Russians. Whilst Medvedev, it's substantially less. I think even on his social media platforms, like especially like Instagram, which has been banned now in Russia, but nevertheless, even before, I think he has less than 1 million followers, and Instagram is actually one of the most popular social media platforms in Russia. So the very fact that he has kind of less than 1 million followers is still an indication that he doesn't have perhaps as much influence as one would think, given that well, I think he's still number one in tennis, but he's just about to lose his title following his loss in the third round. So if the Western countries think that by him kind of denouncing Putin, he would have any influence, I think they're mistaken.
Yeah. So obviously you said there would be certainly consequences for athletes that spoke out in Russia. I think one thing was that there was I think it was a 13-year prison sentence that Russia introduced for, I believe, denigrating the war effort, effectively suggesting, criticizing the war, suggesting Russia's losing when they say they're winning. Do you think the Russian government would ever go as far as trying to impose one of these sanctions on, like prison sentences on athletes, or do you think it would be more the public pressure on athletes that would stop them doing what the British government's asked?
Yeah, I just think that if the athlete plans to continue to live in Russia and to be based in Russia, their hands are tied really. They just I can't see a way how they can criticize the war or the Russian government's decision to invade Ukraine, because they fall under firing line both from the government, because as you said, they might get severely fined or arrested, and the pressure from the public will be so severe that they won't be able to participate in any events in Russia. There've been several kind of well-known Russian people, not from the field of sports, but kind of celebrities, like singers, actors, bloggers, etc., who had to leave Russia permanently because they spoke out against the war. So unfortunately, there is a situation in Russia where if you do criticize the war or the government of Russia, you have to relocate. You can't stay in Russia, and that's kind of the unfortunate truth of the situation there. So for many athletes, I think in football especially, we've seen certain Ukrainian footballers criticizing Russian footballers for not speaking out, but as I said, their hands are tied in many ways. If they were to speak out, they will probably never play football in Russia again. And obviously they can't put their career on hold, despite the horrendous situation that's happening in Ukraine.
I'm trying to make an analogy. The only one I can think of with British athletes would be if somehow Argentina was the world's ultimate sporting superpower. And it'd be quite a plausible situation. They'd say, well, if you're a British athlete and you want to play in our tournament in Argentina, you have to say that the Falkland Islands Malvinas are Argentinian and you must denounce the British government. And if any British athlete did that, in our press, we would be absolutely spitting feathers at them. I'm not saying they'd go to prison, but they'd have no influence on the British public ever again. So it's hard to believe that it's something that's as emotive to Russians and as close to Russia as what's happening, that Britain or any other country would think that this is the way to go. Anyway, so moving on finally to where do you think this is going now? First of all, where do you think by the time Wimbledon happens, for example, the war in Ukraine is going to be? And what do you think that will mean for Russian athletes? And when do you think Russian athletes will be back into the fold as normal athletes?
Yeah, well, in terms of the war, obviously it's difficult to predict anything, but there appear to be some progress in terms of the diplomatic negotiations which are taking place between Russia and Ukraine. Obviously, everything I know comes from what I hear in the news, but there are suggestions that Russian demands seem to be kind of lessening. Obviously, initially there were suggestions that Putin wanted essentially a regime change in Ukraine and perhaps to take over the whole of Ukraine. Given that the Russian war effort doesn't seem to be going to plan, according to many military experts, there have been suggestions made that Putin may agree to just essentially Ukraine to become a military neutral country. There are kind of difficult discussions around the status of Crimea and the Donbass region, but representatives of Turkey, which are currently acting as kind of mediators between Ukraine and Russia, seem to be suggesting that a diplomatic resolution to the conflict is feasible. So I would hope and I would think that by June, when Wimbledon is to take place, the war would end, at least the kind of the hot phase of it. I mean, there might be still some kind of some shootings perhaps in and around the Donbass region, but I would hope that the Russian troops would pull out of Ukraine by June. At the same time, I don't think that the sanctions that have been placed on Russia will be lifted straight away. And I don't think that the athletes will be able to play under the Russian flag as early as June. I think they would still continue to represent Russia as a neutral athlete. But hopefully, if the war was to end by June, I would hope that the UK government would drop the requirement of Russian athletes to kind of denounce Putin. That would still seem extremely extremely severe, really, when the war is no longer ongoing. But nevertheless, I do feel that for the foreseeable future, Russian athletes will feel that kind of weight on their shoulders, and I do think that it's going to be quite difficult for them going forward. I can imagine plenty of people and kind of in the audience not really responding well to Russian athletes. We might see some booing, we might hear some just kind of comments from the audience, etc. And that's the kind of going back to the very start of our conversation. That's the unfortunate truth that many Russians are essentially been thrown in with the government, really, and made to feel responsible for what happened in Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, I'm inclined to agree with you about what's going to happen moving forward. Like just as I think you have as well called it very wrong before. I think we both thought there's no way in a million years that there was going to be an invasion. Like, countries don't invade other countries. Russia's never carried out a regime change war, a full-scale invasion of a country before. But yeah, I think obviously the deals looks like it's getting close to being done. I think Zelensky wants to do a deal. I'm not sure Zelensky personally has ever been that keen on joining NATO. It's can he overcome the Ukrainian public support for joining NATO? So I think if a deal can be done, then we're probably looking at a lot of the sanctions on individual Russians going away, while ones on the government continue due to the general mistrust. I just wonder about another scenario. What if Zelensky can't convince the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian parliament, to agree to a deal? And that, I think, is a more worrying scenario, because I think we're still very much in the phase of what Putin calls a special operation, where Russia's bypassing cities, it's trying to block off the Ukrainian army, it's using high precision weapons. It's not it doesn't seem like it's on a true war footing yet. And I have a bit of a worry that if Zelensky can't get a deal through in Ukraine, then that would be the pretext for Putin to say, well, it's Ukraine that doesn't want to compromise, and now we're moving to the war phase where we're going to do whatever it takes to conquer Ukraine and get a change in approach from them.
I mean, it is a possibility. I guess I would add a few points here. I mean, first of all, obviously Ukraine also carries a very heavy burden of this war. First of all, the casualties. Obviously, there've been suggestions that Russian army has carried more casualties than they expected, but we have to also acknowledge that Ukrainian forces are also taking severe hits as well from the Russians. Secondly, the Ukrainian economy is obviously tanking because of the war. I think the World Bank and IMF said that the Ukraine's economy could kind of decrease anywhere between 10 and 30%. depending on how long the war goes on. And of course, just the humanitarian crisis as well is not stopping. And I think the latter point about the humanitarian crisis is an important one, because I think we would see some pressure perhaps from Europe and potentially from the United States for Ukraine to agree to a deal which benefits all sides. Obviously, there's no way that Ukraine will agree to something that they feel is completely unacceptable to them. And from that in that regard, I think that the status of Crimea is especially challenging. To agree that Crimea is essentially Russian territory. That would obviously be quite a heavy blow to Ukrainian pride, etc. Even though on the ground, Crimea has essentially become Russian territory, and I don't see any way that Russia would ever give it back. But nevertheless, I think if a good deal is in place where the war can end and where Ukraine can become a military neutral country, whilst at the same time being able to continue to develop its cooperation with Europe and perhaps one day join the EU, whether it's in 5 years or 10 years, then I think we'll see pressure from Europe and the United States on Ukraine to agree to such a deal.
Okay, I guess we've got time for today. So thank you very much, Alex.
Thank you, Sam.